The following podcast contains information and real stories about sexual assault and or violence which may be triggering to survivors.
From sporting
in the morning newspapers, a third allegation of sexual assault. By afternoon,
had to
a
fight to
fourth.
share her story of sexual abuse.
Bravery and the strength of Grace Tame.
Another
and
former
people like
staffer
her.
alleging the man had run his hand up her thigh in a cattle bar.
After a rape allegation and a question time sex scandal.
woman who bled heavily.
In 2016, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimated that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced some form of sexual crime since the age of 15. On top of that, most major studies indicate that 25% of young women between ages of 15 and 21 will experience some form of sexual crime within that 6-year time frame. This is far too high. In a time where the world is changing so fast, sexual crimes seem to be regularly dominating the news, which begs the question, why is this and how can we help prevent it? I'm your host, Byron, a 22-year-old podcaster from Sydney, Australia. Join me as I interview Brent, one of Australia's most respected communicators in the field of sexual crime, criminal profiling and personal safety in secondary schools and universities. He may have been to your school. Having spoken to over 900,000 students on the subject, this podcast aims to educate young people around the reality of sexual crimes and the severity of these crimes. Together, we explore the legal definitions as well as the ethical and moral, wrapping these up in metaphors and stories in an easy to listen to and easy to understand way. Welcome to this episode. Welcome back to the podcast. We're going to be talking about definitions for this episode. Very, very important. And I think everyone needs to understand the definitions for these crimes and what they actually are, because it's, as I'm sure you would know, many people have no idea. And often, I think, when you do your talks, this is where people have their big shift. They go, oh my God, I had no idea that's what that meant. I had no idea sexual assault meant this and this. I thought it was just this. Because that's how we've been conditioned thanks to movies and the way we've grown up. So we'll start off, I guess, did you want to go with the kind of the main crime and then go down and just...
Yeah, the high level, we can come down. And you're right, Byron, you know, I would say the overwhelming majority of young people I speak to who come forward to tell me or who perhaps sadly leave my talks because they realise they've had a sexual offence committed against them. Most of them, I'm going to say probably 9 out of 10, didn't know until they heard some of these definitions. Now, we've also gone into some consent definitions in other podcasts, which is part of this area as well, because if you mistakenly think that you have consented, then what happened to you is not unlawful. So when you learn what consent is and what it isn't, you may realise that what I thought was consent actually wasn't, therefore what that person did was a criminal offence. The same principle applies when we look at terms like sexual assault, rape, awful terms like this, and sexual intercourse. It's understanding those definitions that enables people to apply the definition to what has happened to them, which can sometimes sadly lead to the realisation, hang on, that means that what happened to me was a criminal offence.
Yeah.
So...
Which, by the way, you get a lot of that, don't you?
Look, almost every seminar I do with young women, and again, it's because the age of young women that I present to are in that high-risk age group, 15 to 21. It's very rare for me to do a seminar to, say, 100 young women, year 10, year 11, year 12, university, without young women coming forward during the break or at the end to disclose that something's happened to them. Wow. Most of them realise what happened was a criminal offence as a result of sitting into in the talk.
Unbelievable.
So we've looked at consent and we've defined that. So then we've got this term like, say, rape. Rape is a term that everybody listening to the podcast has heard of. Rape is an old legal term that basically describes sexual intercourse without consent. Now, I don't want to get too much into semantics around this. We mentioned as part of the introduction that people will be listening to this podcast outside of New South Wales, possibly outside of Australia. And in Australia, each state and territory has its own Crimes Act, if you will. They even have different names for that. But so we do have a variation in some of the terminology around this, and that can actually add to the confusion. So I'm going to try to eliminate the confusion.
Especially once you add in like American movies and they're using terms.
All that.
We're used to all these words Americans use, like, a lot of criminal terms we see in movies that don't actually exist here.
Yeah, look, you're right. So let's start at the beginning and move out. If we look at a term like rape, the term rape is only actually a legal term in 2 states in Australia.
Right.
Victoria and Queensland still use the word rape. Now, you and I and those listening to this podcast, of course, can still use the term rape to describe that awful crime of sexual intercourse without consent. Most states and territories in Australia, the term rape does not exist legally, meaning when you go to court and you are going to be charged with having sexual intercourse with another person without the consent, there's only 2 states where you're charged with rape. In New South Wales, we replaced the term rape with the term sexual assault 40 years ago. So in 1981, in New South Wales, the term rape was thrown away and we replaced it with the term sexual assault. The definition pretty much stayed the same. Means the same thing.
Yeah.
The point I'm making is everyone's heard of rape. Most people have heard of sexual assault. Most people think, understandably, it's 2 terms to describe 2 different type of offences. The confusion is it is in Queensland, but it's not in New South Wales. In New South Wales, sexual assault replaced the term rape. Okay, so let's look at that. So whether we're using the term rape or sexual assault, we're pretty much talking about the same thing. One's an old term, one's the term that replaced it. So sexual assault or rape is sexual intercourse without consent. We've spoken about consent and we've looked into the definitions of that. Another area of confusion in my experience is accurately defining the legal definition of sexual intercourse. And what often happens here, and it's very understandable, is we mistakenly think that the biological definition is the same as the legal definition.
You said this on our episode, and it is fantastic. This is phenomenal because you're so right. We think, oh, sex is this, therefore sexual assault must be this.
Yeah.
It's not the case.
Yeah, no, look, and it's the fundamental reason why most young people I speak to who have been subjected to sexual intercourse without consent have been told by well-meaning friends that they haven't been. And it's not a criticism of the friends. It's an acceptance that what's happened there is they've looked at sexual intercourse without consent through a biological prism as opposed to a legal one. So here's how I present this in my talks. I say, let's say, for example, and I'm going to use a male to female example. It doesn't have to be legally, and we've been saying this, Byron, through all of our chats. The law is not gender specific. But I want people to, as they're listening to this, also to be able to get maybe a clear picture in their mind so that it helps with getting clarity.
And as we mentioned, this is just the most common example. Therefore, it makes sense we use that example.
It is. It is the most common. So let's say we have a young man and a young woman down the back of a party, say on Saturday night. There could be a different environment, but let's say that's what we're working with. And they start having a bit of a kiss and a cuddle, getting on pretty well. Things start going a little bit further. Now let's say it gets to a point where the young man starts to go a bit further than that, and the young woman starts to feel uncomfortable. So she tells him, look, no, I'm not comfortable, can you stop? Now let's say the guy doesn't stop. Let's say he continues. Let's say he creates in his mind some sort of strange justification that, well, she's saying no, but I'm just going to keep on pushing here. He may believe that if I can get her to stop saying no, that's consent, so that's okay. And we've discussed in an earlier podcast how that's totally out of sync with the law.
Manipulation, yeah.
Yeah. Let's say the young woman repeatedly tells him to stop and he still won't. She puts up some resistance to him. It still doesn't work. And she thinks, goodness, this is getting really ugly. He seemed like a really nice guy in the lounge room at the party. He's not. I need to get back inside. I need to get from where I am to somewhere safe. And she tries to get back inside and he stops her and he physically restrains her. So now we've gone from him pushing back verbally, perhaps psychologically, now physically. Now anybody that's listened to our podcast on consent would know consent has gone out the window.
Yeah, completely.
Gone out the window because any change of mind that comes from that young woman has not been achieved freely. It's not been reached freely. It's as a result of him using threats, force, violence, coercion. So just to be really, really clear on this point, if at that point, using our analogy, and there's plenty of others that we could use, but just using this one, even if that point, if that young person who's been subjected to that verbal and physical force, changes their mind, goes, oh, okay, this is not consent. It's submission. It's a person changing their mind under duress, under pressure, as a result of threats, force, violence, coercion, manipulation. Now, once we've listened into the consent podcast or we have that knowledge, we know that. So we're left with one last piece of the puzzle. Using our hypothetical scenario, the next question is, okay, what does that young man in this instance have to do to have sexual intercourse with that young woman? legally. We all know sexual intercourse without consent is a serious crime.
Yeah.
Whether you want to call it rape or New South Wales sexual assault, it doesn't really matter. We know it's a serious crime. Most people respectfully probably don't know the legal definition of sexual intercourse.
Yeah.
So we're left with that question, okay, what does this guy have to do down the back of this party to, under legal determination, have had sexual intercourse with this girl? Well, here's the problem. If we go to a biology textbook for our answer, the answer we get's really clear, it's black and white, but it's a biological answer. It's the wrong answer because you've gone to the wrong source. So biology would say, for that, using this example, for that young man to have sexual intercourse with that young woman down the back of the party, we've established in our example it's without consent. Yes. Biology would say he would have to penetrate her to a sexual area with one specifically nominated body part, the penis. Because biology has always and will always define sexual intercourse as penile penetration for procreation. It's like, if you will, it's very close to like a biblical definition. It's procreation. It's that. And that's fine. That's great. In a theological discussion, in a biological discussion, that's all fantastic. The problem is where that definition makes its way into defining a sexual crime. That's the problem, because the legal definition is totally different. And this is in every state and territory in Australia. We might have different terminology. We might have slightly different terms of imprisonment for different crimes. But the definitions remain fairly consistent. So let's ask that question, not of a biology person, but let's ask, say, for example, a detective in the sex crimes unit. What does that young man down the back of that party who's now stopping this girl from going so, what would he have to do legally to have sexual intercourse with this young person? And if it's without consent, we have that criminal offence.
And do you ask people this question in your presentations?
Yeah, I do. I ask it almost metaphorically, let's go from the biological answer over here. We know what that is. Now let's go over here and say, okay, is the legal answer different? So let's say we go to a detective in the sex crimes unit and ask them, what does he have to do to have sexual intercourse? What she will tell you, the detective will tell you, she won't take her quote from a biology textbook. She'll take it from the law. So New South Wales, she will take it directly from Section 61 of the New South Wales Crimes Act. It's there, stated. Now this is what you'll hear from a detective. For that young man to have sexual intercourse with that young woman, and if it's without consent, it's sexual intercourse without consent, serious crime, he would have to only penetrate her to a sexual area with anything at all. Anything. Now, if we just stop that just right there, look at the difference between that and how most people define sexual intercourse, which is biological, which is penile penetration. That is it. The law says, no, our definition is different. We define sexual intercourse has occurred when a person penetrates another person to a sexual area with anything at all. Now, the law goes on to say that means anything at all means any part of the offender's body used for penetration, anything that is held or manipulated by the offender, and under Australian law, sexual intercourse also includes oral sex. So in most legal contexts, it states something along the lines of forced oral sex is legally defined as the introduction of the penis to the mouth without consent. So here's the issue, and people are perhaps starting to see this as they're hearing this information. Young woman down the back of a party has something terrible happen to her. A person has intercourse with her without her consent. She comes inside afterwards, is able to get away, seeks advice of well-meaning friends. Often what happens is, if what happened to her is not penile penetration to a sexual area, she's told, this is awful, this is terrible, it's a terrible thing that's happened, but thank God he didn't rape you.
Right. Because they're just saying he just did some stuff with his fingers, or made penetrate with his fingers.
Yeah.
And in his head, I didn't have sex with her.
Yeah.
I just did some stuff.
And you know what's interesting here is if we put the law aside just for a moment, if we look at major studies in Australia around this awful crime, if we look at the number one most common form of sexual intercourse without consent committed against young women aged 15 to 21 in Australia, number one most common is a young woman being penetrated sexually by a guy using his fingers without consent. That is the most common. That's the most common disclosure I get. I get those disclosures every week. Most of those young women will tell you that they had been told by well-meaning friends that what that guy did was awful. Yeah, he's an asshole. It's a dog act, terrible thing, but thank God he didn't rape you. And they say that with good intention because to them, that's not sexual intercourse because sexual intercourse is a biologically defined act of penile penetration, where the police, the law, the courts, the Crimes Act would say that's the number one form of intercourse without consent. It is penetration to a sexual area with any part of the offender's body. Number one most common form of intercourse without consent, penetration with the fingers.
Yep.
Second most common form of intercourse without consent committed against young women aged 15 to 21 in Australia, and we know this through research, is a young woman being forced into performing oral sex without consent, which is legally defined by the law as the introduction of the penis to the mouth without full consent. Now, respectfully, without this type of information, a lot of people listening into this podcast would probably respectfully not consider the act of oral sex, either performing it or having it performed on them, to be an act of sexual intercourse. Now that's cool. That's their business. That's their prerogative.
Do you know why? Because we're trained about foreplay, and then you have sex. Or you do all this stuff and then you have sex.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way we grow up. That's what you think it is.
And also, it's a million miles away from that biological definition that we grow up learning as we go through school. So I respect totally that most young people I talk to prior to hearing this would not have considered oral sex, as an example, to be an act of sexual intercourse. It is. Under every state and territory in Australia, oral sex is an act of sexual intercourse. So then, oral sex without consent is sexual intercourse without consent. So to put it into very much basic terms, if a person forces another person into giving them a blowjob, that would be legally identified as the introduction of the penis to the mouth without full consent. That's sexual assault. That's rape. Now, New South Wales, that carries up to 14 years in prison. We're going to talk more about consequences and things as we go into later podcasts. But so just getting that aspect of the definition wrong, if we mistakenly think intercourse can only be achieved through penile penetration, where we are sweeping under the carpet most of the sexual intercourse without consent committed against the young women probably listening to this podcast. Okay, so it's a really important area to clarify. Sadly, when I present my talks, I actually give a warning, and I know that you'll have this on these podcasts. I actually give it in my talks before I give this. I give it at the start of my talk when I'm talking to young women, and then I say, now, girls, I'm going to share with you in just a moment the legal definition of sexual intercourse. But before I do, I want to remind you that this can be very, very confronting for some. This will be quite different to what a lot of you believe. And this could, for some in the room, lead you to a realization that you yourself have been subjected to this offence. I have to give that warning because I know after 25 years of doing these talks, this piece of information, probably more than any other, is what leads to people realising they've been subjected to a rape as opposed to what their friends told them wasn't. So definitions of these legal terms is a really important thing. It's important for young men. It's important for young women. It's important for all of us to know this.
Absolutely. I think, as we mentioned it before, as a young guy, if that guy in that situation, if he had sat through your tour and was aware of all this stuff, would he have made this decision to do that stuff with it? And maybe he would have. Yeah.
And look, we can't use ignorance to the law as an excuse because it's not an excuse legally. But I know, my belief is this. There is a percentage of sexual crimes that could be eliminated by more young men, in particular, who are usually the ones committing this crime, having this knowledge.
I agree. 100%.
It doesn't mean that without the knowledge, you're not responsible for your actions. You are. It just means if you speak to police who work in this field, and I used to, they'll tell you that they have sat in front of young men who have penetrated usually a young woman sexually with their fingers without consent, who often freely admit it in the interview and shrug their shoulders. I've done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
Or a young guy that says, I didn't rape her, I just got her to give me a blowjob and then I let her go back into the party, or I let her out of the car. I gave her a lift home. I just got her to give me a blowjob in the car, then I let her get out of the car. Now, that language, and I've heard it in a police interview.
That's not good language.
There's no consent there.
Yeah.
But it's a defence put forward by somebody who clearly thinks that those actions, what's the big deal? those two statements are statements that define some of the most common forms of rape that are committed against young women. And so we can't help but argue or think that the more that young men get this, and I speak to more young men than young women over a 12-month period. I speak to 40,000 students a year, but that's a drop in the ocean in some regards. And so many young men come up to me after my talks at school and university say, you know what, I'd never heard this. I didn't know. And that doesn't mean that those same young guys were going to run out on Saturday night and do this.
Of course not.
But if so many are saying that, in amongst that you've got some who you are reducing the risk. Now, for those who are on the receiving end of these crimes terribly, this information can't change what's happened to them. But what this information can do is, quite rightly, identify for them that they have been subjected to a sexual offence. And it's not them that's done anything wrong, it's the offender. And for many young people who go through these crimes, not for all, but for some, just hearing these definitions enables them to identify what's happened, to justify how they feel about it, and then make decisions as to what they want to do next. Now, that could be reporting, it may not be. But without this knowledge, reporting is not even presenting itself as an option, because you're told that what happened to you it's no big deal. And that's no good for anybody.
Yeah.
So, So when we talk about a term like rape, we know it's sexual intercourse without consent. But respectfully, a lot of people get the definition of sexual intercourse wrong, and they get the definition of consent wrong. That's why we've done, I think, 3, maybe 4 podcasts on consent, because there's different pillars. That's why we're doing this on definitions around things like sexual intercourse. Really
Absolutely.
Important.
And I agree with you. I think if we had this education, more young men and women could get this education at an earlier age. I do believe there would be less sexual crimes happening, because they're aware of what they're actually doing. I think it's kind of like ignorance is bliss in some of those situations. As you mentioned, there were men or young men who would willingly admit what they've done because they didn't believe it was a crime, because they had no idea what they'd done was actually rape.
Now, it doesn't excuse it. It doesn't justify it. It doesn't make the impact of what they've done any less on the person they've done it to. But it does ask the question, and I keep coming back to it, and part of my motivation doing my talks to young men is, if they'd had the knowledge, would it have reduced the likelihood of them crossing this line that they didn't even know existed? I'd have to think it would.
I would like to hope so. We can't know for sure, but I would like to hope so.
What often happens at this stage in my talks, Byron, is we get that nailed down, and people are going, okay, now I've got some real clarity around that legal definition of intercourse. What that leads to is often a hand going up, and young men ask this as often as young women do. What if the intimate exchange, which was unconsensual, what if it doesn't go that far? This is a really common question. What if it's just when somebody touches somebody sexually without their consent, and the touching doesn't lead to intercourse? So when we're talking about rape or sexual assault, we're talking about sexual intercourse without consent. Then we look at that definition. Penetration to a sexual area with anything at all also includes oral sex. Okay, we've got that. The next question is, all right, that's great, but what about all those situations at a party or whatever where somebody's groped or touched sexually?
Or in a club. I think a club's a classic example.
Whatever, at a concert, in a mosh pit, all these type of things. So these questions come up. Now, here's how I respond to that. Underneath the crime of sexual intercourse without consent, in every state and territory, we have a crime of what is basically touching somebody to a sexual area without consent. Now, as we've alluded to before, there's different terms used to describe this. Queensland would call what we're going to talk about now sexual assault. New South Wales used to call this indecent assault. We now call it unlawful sexual touching. It's called indecent assault in the ACT. So again, I fully understand people's confusion, because there's all these terms that roll around.
And once you add that worldwide, it's like, wow.
Oh, for sure. But let's get away from the terms and look at the ingredients. Here's what the law says. If somebody touches you to a sexual area or makes you touch them sexually without your consent, and that touching doesn't progress to intercourse, which is what we were talking about before, that is still a criminal offence. It's just a different offence. And to put it into a legal context, it drops down. So we've got rape or sexual assault up here. Sexual intercourse without consent carries a substantial imprisonment term. Underneath that, we have the slightly different offence of touching somebody to a sexual area or making somebody touch you sexually without their consent. So the law makes the distinction between intercourse without consent, and touching. So, to look at it from a legal perspective, what we're talking about here is, let's say, for example, we have a young woman who is touched to a sexual area without permission, without consent. Sexual area of a female under legal interpretation for this type of offence is generally considered to be touching to the breasts or touching between the legs. It can also extend to somebody forcing another person to touch them sexually. So it could be a male getting someone to touch them between the legs.
Didn't think about that.
Touching can be over the top of clothing. It can be underneath. So going back to the analogy we were using before of, say, two young people at a party, and we'll use the analogy of the young guy with the young girl. Doesn't have to be, but that's what we'll run with. She wants to go back inside to her friends. He doesn't let her. In our earlier analogy, we looked at how far does he have to go to have intercourse with that girl. Well, legally, he would have to penetrate her to a sexual area with anything at all, or force her into performing oral sex without consent. Okay, we've got that down. What about if it doesn't go that far? What about if, using an example, he stops the girl going back inside and then puts his hand on her breasts on the outside of her top or inside, and she's telling him to stop and he won't? Or he puts his hand between her jeans over the top of her legs. He's touching her to a sexual area, but no penetration. Or he grabs her hand and forces her to touch him sexually between the legs, either over the top of his jeans or inside. Now we have the crime of unlawful sexual touching, or touching someone to a sexual area, or being made to touch someone sexually. Now, the labels for this are different as you go around. Indecent assault, some states sexual assault, others like New South Wales now unlawful sexual touching. But all that aside, it is a criminal offence under Australian law to touch someone to a sexual area or make that person touch you. Now, it carries a variant of imprisonment terms. New South Wales up to 5 years, ACT 7 years, Queensland 10 years. So these are serious crimes. And they are far, far more common than the higher level crime of intercourse without consent. Being touched to a sexual area without consent is number one most common crime committed against young women in Australia aged 15 to 21. 99.9% of people who come forward to tell me it's happened to them tell me they had no idea until they'd sat through the
talk. We haven't been taught this.
I had a question the other day where a girl said to me, "Does this law apply inside school?" I said, "Yeah, definitely. We don't have crimes that stop at the gate of a school." And I'm not being critical. And I said, "Oh, why do you ask?" She said, and one-on-one, she said, "Oh, this happened to me 2 days ago at school. Guy came up to me, I was talking to my friends, just ran up and grabbed me on the breast really hard. It really hurt." She said, "We just thought it was he's a dick, he's an idiot, nothing you can do." She said, "Is that a criminal offence?" I said, "That is a criminal offence. That is unlawful sexual touching. It carries up to 5 years imprisonment." Now, you don't have to report that, but you're entitled to know that you can.
Yes.
Then if you choose to, that's an option. This is a girl who said, "I had no idea until I'd never even heard of this stuff."
I think also gives her more confidence when stuff like that happens. She can tell him to stop because she knows what he's actually doing.
Well, and also, there's a 99% likelihood the person who did it was probably sitting in the boys' talk that I did that day, who's also hearing for the first time that what you did to try and big note yourself to your mates is actually a criminal offence.
Yeah.
So we have sexual intercourse without consent, which is a criminal offence. Sexual intercourse being penetration to a sexual area with anything at all, also forced oral sex. Then underneath it, in every state and territory, we have the lesser offence, but still a serious crime, of sexual touching without consent. We often think of that crime, Byron, in the context of an adult, older person doing that to a child.
Yeah,
that's how we all often hear that. I was doing a university lecture a year or so back, and I had a young 19-year-old young woman come up who said, "I've just realised that crime happened to me when I was in year 7. She'd got on a bus after having a music lesson at school, and I was on this bus. This is what would be 6 years ago, or 6 years prior to her speaking to me. Sat on the bus. It was a 20-minute drive home. The bus is fairly empty because it's 4 o'clock, so no school kids on it. They've all gone. She sits on the bus on a seat next to the window, reading a book. Pulls into a stop. Guy gets on. She said about my age, who at the time was about the age of her dad. Could sit anywhere on the bus. There's only 2 or 3 people on the bus.
Yeah.
He comes right up to the back, sits right next to this young girl. She's 12. Yeah, she's in year 7.
Wow.
And She said, I can remember to this day. Now, she's telling me this very emotionally. She said, I can remember how frightened I felt, how scared I felt. And she said, I'm thinking, why is this person the age of my dad sitting next to me? You know, she said, but I was too scared to say anything. I was too scared to do anything. Bus pulls away from the curb. He leans in towards her and pins her between his shoulder and the bus window.
Right.
Then he starts to touch her between the legs over the top of her school pants. He puts another hand up. She said she was so terrified, so frightened, she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She couldn't look up from her book. He then grabbed her hand, forcing her to touch him, put his hand inside his pants. He'd undone his fly, getting her to touch him. And this went on for 5 or 10 minutes. Then the bus pulls into a stop. He gets up, gets off the bus. That's it. 6 years later, that young woman's sitting in a university lecture, and she's hearing for the first time the legal definition of what happened to her. And she came up to me at the end of the talk in tears. I've never told anyone this, ever,
Wow.
she said. And the reason I've never told anyone, part of me thought it was my fault. Part of me thought I wouldn't be believed. And she said also, even at that young age, I thought, well, it's not rape, so there's nothing I can do anyway. And she said, I'm now 19, and today in this talk, I've heard for the first time that what that man did to me was a criminal offence. She said, that doesn't change what he did, but it totally changes how I think about it. Now, what he did was an aggravated or more serious version, because it's an adult to a child, so the imprisonment term goes even higher. Now, look, we know, realistically, the chance of finding that guy who was on that bus 10 minutes for 10 minutes
ago.
there's zero. But that's not the point. She wasn't saying, I'm going to rush off to report this. Now, technically she could. There's no time limit. She said, as a result of hearing this, it's totally reconfigured in my mind what happened and put the blame where it belongs, at the feet of this guy, not at the feet of a 12-year-old.
Because she felt like she was responsible.
Yeah.
And
she
also,
thought it was her fault.
maybe she's got a younger sister. Maybe she's going to share this conversation with people in her family and her life.
So whichever way we look at it, and it's very much an ethos, Byron, behind what we're doing here with these chats. There's no downside to having this information. And even though I know that when I'm giving this information out, either through a podcast or in a lecture at a school or university, there are people sadly there listening to me or listening to this podcast who are going, oh my goodness, this has happened to me. I had no idea. They've been hit by this realisation that they have tragically been subjected to a sexual crime. My view is there is no person more entitled to this knowledge than that person. No person more entitled than that person. Now, what they choose to do with this knowledge is absolutely none of my business. But goodness, if you have had a crime committed against you, which is a sexual offence which carries a substantial imprisonment term, surely, under any reasonable test, you're entitled to know. Most have no idea that when they've been touched sexually without consent, that it's a criminal offence.
And let's remember, she was blaming herself.
Blame yourself.
At least now she can know, okay, that was totally, I did nothing wrong. I was just sitting there minding my own business.
She was sitting on the bus.
It's not my fault at all.
Yeah.
And I was a victim.
Yeah.
Basically.
Look, I've had girls come up to me, schoolgirls, year 11 schoolgirls, who 3 or 4 of them have been collectively had this crime, decent assault, whatever you want to call this. Might be 7 or 8 times it's happened to them collectively by the same guy who's done it.
Wow.
And they come forward in my talks and say, hey, this is the first time we've realised that if we chose to, we could report this. I had a girl recently who had been subjected to this offence 3 times by the same guy. And the guy was actually in my talk that I did at that school in the morning. And she was a year 11 student who came in the afternoon. Now, that young man who had done what this young girl alleged he has done is probably sitting in my talk going, I've done this.
Yeah. And he knows that they're hearing the information from you, probably going...
Yeah, he's walking out at recess, the girls are coming in. He's committed, that we know of, 7 of these indecent assaults against these girls. Each one carries New South Wales 5 years. That's 35 years worth of offences. And up until my talk, he would have probably gone, what's the big deal? It's just a laugh.
Yeah. That's a key word, isn't it? Just a laugh.
It's just a laugh, no big deal.
It's such a big one. And I wanted to give another example of just this indecent assault. I mentioned it to you kind of off camera.
Yeah.
I was talking to this woman. I was just talking about our episode and stuff, and she was just saying, now that I'm an adult and I actually know this stuff, when I was about, 19, 21 or something, I was in a train, and peak hour of the train was very packed.
Yeah.
And this guy was like kind of thrusting against her in the train while she was against the wall. And he was like, it wasn't obvious. He did it subtly, but he was kept kind of like thrusting against her.
Yeah, that would be that would meet the legal criteria for this offence.
And it was pretty bad. And she was just saying, you know, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. I was scared for my life. I think he might have grabbed her or something. And then as soon as the train doors open, he was gone. Same as the bus example.
Yeah, and you know that stays with people. And you know, we think that these situations are only going to be frightening when it's isolated, when we're on our own. I've spoken to women on packed trains in Sydney at peak hour that have been sitting or standing next to a guy who starts to do this. Now, look, it doesn't happen. It's far more likely to occur in a context like at a school or a party or a concert or something like that. But equally, it can happen on a bus or on a train. And when you speak to those women, and it's nearly always women who are targeted for this, it's a terrifying experience. And I can speak to women in a corporate environment in my age group who recount something like this happened to them 20 or 30 years ago. Yeah. And they start crying as they're relaying, and they start to visibly get really frightened by just relaying the story. So, and this is a crime that most people are unaware even sits in the Crimes Act. Now, this doesn't mean that all of these people who, God forbid, have had this done to them have to race off and report it. But what these people will say to you is, that's not how I'm looking at this. I'm looking at this now now I know that what happened to me was an offence. That justifies how I felt. It justifies my feeling of being exploited or being invaded sexually, and it makes me feel I was entitled to be upset, to be angry, to be whatever, and it puts the blame of this offence at the foot of the person who committed it, not at the foot of the person who had it committed against them. And I think that can be underestimated with regards to the power that can provide somebody. We can't change what that person's gone through, but we can identify it for them so that they can move forward.
I think it can be quite empowering. Definitely. And like as you mentioned, it's very easy to just be like, oh, it happened once. You know, it happened. It's in the past. It's like, it is in the past, but it's going to almost PTSD sort of thing. A lot of these things, they feel like, you know, they'll remember how scared they felt at the time. Yeah. I'm sure that girl in the bus who's 12 will never forget that experience.
Oh, look, never. You carry that stuff with you, and you know, and all the fear that gets associated with that. That we've got a young girl in year 7 who has to take the bus to and from school for the rest of her schooling life.
Yes.
Just each time that little girl is standing in that bus stop waiting to get, just imagine, you know, if that was your daughter, how that would feel. Not just for the next 2 or 3 days.
I would argue she's going to be scared of buses for the rest of her life.
All that sort of stuff. It's all that flowing. Now, again, knowing this offence doesn't stop it from happening per se, but it's a step in the direction along raising awareness and reducing it and getting people talking about it and things such as that. So again, no downside to having these discussions. So, you know, what we've really focused on here, Byron, are a couple of key definitions in crimes that people have a little bit of knowledge on, some more than others, but these are often areas that are missed in their knowledge or their ability to define. And once we fill in these gaps for folks, I think it makes a big difference to their overall understanding of this.
I agree. And that's the whole reason we wanted to put this kind of information out there. So is there any final thoughts around definitions when it comes to this stuff?
Yeah, look, I think that's sort of about it. Look, I guess we could lump it into here. A question that will often come up after these discussions is there a time limit to reporting stuff like this? So if somebody is listening into the podcast who may sadly be realising, okay, based on what I've heard here, that means that what happened to me last week, last month, last year, by definition is a criminal offence. A question that will often come up in the mind of that person is, if I chose to report this, and that's a choice, you don't have to, what's the time limit to reporting it? There's no time limit. We don't have, the legal term for that is a statute of limitations. We don't have a statute of limitation for reporting sex crimes in Australia. Now, you mentioned before, Byron, and it's a really valid point, that we often use these Americanized terms because that's what we see on TV, Netflix and things.
CSI and all that.
Yeah. There are some states in America that for some sexual crime have some statute of limitations. So we can watch that TV show and it's really exciting because the police in the TV show are chasing after a sex offender. They've got 3 hours to catch him, and then they've got an hour and they've got 10 minutes before. We don't have that here in Australia. We have no statute of limitations. So anybody who's listening into the podcast thinking, you know, can I report that after the event? Yeah, there's no time limit. Now, look, obviously, as with reporting any type of crime, the longer it's left, sometimes the more difficult it can be to gather sufficient evidence to take a case to court and prove it. But that's a different discussion versus, can I report something a week later, a month later, a year later, 10, 20 years? Yeah. You can report a sexual crime any time in the future.
And to clarify, you've experienced that, haven't you? You've had girls who have attended your talk report crimes from a while ago.
Yeah, I had a case I gave evidence in last year. I can't give too much away, but it went to court in, I think, June or July last year, which was 2020. That was first reported to me by a student in Year 9 in 1996. Wow. So it's 24 years. And I got called by the police, and they had done an initial investigation 24 years earlier. And at that time, there was insufficient evidence to get it to court where they thought they could prove it beyond reasonable doubt. It was a cold case for over 20 years, and it got reopened by a team of detectives to reinvestigate it. And they did, and they found 3 or 4 other people who came forward to lay allegations against this individual who had targeted this young girl when she was in Year 9. So I got a phone call probably February last year, and I had to give a statement to a detective. I couldn't give much detail, to be fair, but that case went to court 24 years after that young girl had a chat to me at a school. So look, of course that's not always going to happen, but it's average time in Australia. The average time frame between a sexual offence committed against a child, say primary school age child, and that offence being reported, and sadly a lot of them aren't, if they are, average time frame in Australia is about 26 years.
Wow.
For child sexual crimes to be reported.
Wow.
So
okay.
So we've got no statute of limitation on that.
I mean, look, we'll wrap this up, but do you think we could reduce that by putting out education to people at a younger age?
Oh, look, sure. Oh, look, no, there's no doubt. The tricky balance there is what's age appropriate in the subject matter for little ones at primary school, early high school. But look, yeah, it's a tricky area. I mean, it's not a cop out, but I do primarily my talks are designed to cover issues for young people 15 and up. Okay, and I'm often asked, will you go younger? Will you go younger? And yes, I can adopt a talk for a slightly younger audience. But then there's a point I'd have to say, look, I need to hand that baton to someone else, because for 25 years I've worked in this area. That's what I focus on. And I have some degree of expertise in doing that. But if I was asked to speak to a group of Year 6 or Year 7 students, the stuff that I talk about to young students, Year 10, Year 11, is inappropriate for them. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a space for those young children to have this knowledge. It's just we need to look at, okay, how do we give it to them in a way which is educational, that's not overbearing and terrifying them, or giving them information at an age where they just, or in a way that they just don't really fully understand what it is that's been spoken about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
it's a tricky one.
It's very tricky, and hopefully we can, we'll see how that goes. But I think earlier the better, in my opinion, because we're seeing 13, 14, as young as that, we're seeing stuff like, sexual crimes happening at that age. Yeah, you mentioned that girl was 12 on the bus. So it's like...
Yeah, no, look, you're right. And I think it's fair to say that in the primary schools around this country, I can't speak for others, they do that stranger danger talk, and there's a lot of validity with that, the good touch, bad touch, and they do all those sort of things, which is fantastic. But as with all of that, it's like maths, English. If you've got a great teacher, you'll learn, and it's fantastic. You remember it. If you've got a teacher that's been told you've got to do this, and, oh, geez, I'm not particularly comfortable with this, it's not a criticism of them. It's like me going in to teach astrophysics.
Yeah,
it's like, well, I'm not that comfortable with it, but I'll have a go.
Yeah, doesn't mean you're going to be good at it.
Doesn't mean I'm going to be good, and the kids switch off because this is boring, or they ask a few questions and I don't know the answer. So the practicality is one thing and the intent is another, Absolutely. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah. Awesome. I think it's been a great episode. I learned a lot from this. This could be one of the most powerful episodes when it comes to realizing that this stuff might have happened to you. And as per usual, we mentioned in other episodes, we'll put links below for helplines. We'll have instructions on what we suggest to do. Helplines, you can actually go to the police, you can start talking to a friend or a family, just start talking about it and just raising awareness around it. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
Thanks, Brent. Thank you so much for making it all the way through this episode. After hearing the contents of this podcast, many may realize the sad reality of what has happened to them. If this is you and you seek help or guidance on what to do next, please click the link in the show notes. It'll redirect you to some resources as well as a helpline if you want to talk to someone anonymous. As you'll hear in other episodes, Brent and I do mention how important it is to start talking to someone, whether that's a family member, a friend, or it could be someone anonymous on a helpline. They are trained professionals and we highly recommend you start this conversation. As you'll hear as well, in no way do you have to report this crime. This is completely up to you, but know that there are resources and links provided in the show notes below should you seek guidance.